given all that we are seeing right now, we're hearing U.S. officials talk about Kursk collapsing for Ukraine within months. They've already lost more than at least half of what they've gained. Talk about what are the biggest shockwaves for you, the biggest developments for you, Scott, with this conflict over the year, and how does it inform the present situation?
Well, I mean, what we've seen is consistency in the Russian approach here. The Russians have made it the goal and their objective, the physical destruction of the Ukrainian armed forces. This has been frustrating to analysts such as myself who are used to seeing arrows advance on a map. But the Russians have decided that it's far better to do the work up front and destroy the military than it is to carry out very expensive offensive operations that seize territory but at great cost, and allow the enemy a chance to withdraw, regroup, and then force you to do it all over again. The Russians have, over the course of the last year, carried out a brutally efficient offensive operation with singular focus on killing as many Ukrainians as possible, and they've been tragically very effective at it. And I say tragically because even though I view Russia being on the right side of history, and I view the Ukrainian regime as possessing an ideology that is odious, linked to Stepan Bandera. Human life is human life, and there are, by some estimates now, over 1 million Ukrainians dead or permanently injured because of this conflict. And that's because of the absolute lethality of the Russians. That doesn't mean that the Ukrainians aren't putting up a fight. The Russians have taken serious casualties themselves. I don't know if it was a misspoke or the Russians just decided to come out and say it, but I think the mayor of Moscow spoke of rehabilitation centers in and around Moscow that have rehabilitated 600,000 Russian wounded. That's a number that's greater than I had assessed. But it, again, I don't know he said it, so we have to wonder if maybe that's the case, and which means Russia has taken greater casualties. I think wounded is so. I think the Russian dead aren't that much, because the way the battle's being fought lately, forget all the propaganda you read. The Russians aren't carrying out human wave assaults and suicidal attacks. There are probes that are made by platoon and company-sized forces that sometimes get thrown back, and thrown back with violence. But those aren't human wave attacks. Generally speaking, the Russians seek to combine superior intelligence with superior firepower and command and control, and they very bit by bit just go in there and take out this bunker, that bunker. If you've watched the battles, the videotapes where the commander is literally telling the soldiers on the ground, he's in the trench next to you, to your left, come to the trench to your left, shoot to your left, advance. And you do this, and I've talked to some commanders and some journalists on the ground, and they say there's days that go by without a single Russian death in some of the major fighting where they're advancing. There are wounded. The Ukrainians are very effective at flooding the zone with drones, and the drones have proven to be perhaps the greatest impediment to even swifter Russian advances. But this has been a bloody, grinding war that now has reached the phase where Russia has worn the Ukrainian armed forces down to the point where they're starting to get the bigger advances. And we're seeing this measured in kilometers per day, not tens of meters or hundreds of meters. And as the situation unfolds every day, the Ukrainians are put in a worse position. They don't have troops to man the totality of the front. And I just think we're going to see the Russians, start an even bigger push as the Ukrainians lose the kind of cohesion necessary to maintain a constant, line of defense along the totality of the line of contact. And this is something that, I've been predicting this for for some time now, ever since the Russians got into the war of attrition. I think I was far too optimistic about how quickly Russia would be able to achieve, this transition, the correlation of forces that would lead to the collapse of the Ukrainian armed force. It was inevitable. It was going to happen. The question is, why did it take this long? And I think the answers are the Ukrainians are just a hell of a lot better at fighting than I had given them credit for. I mean, even the Russians that I talked to, when I tried to explain this, they said, well, we want them to surrender, but they don't. They fight to the death. And we have to go in and we literally have to pull them out or kill them or bury them in every basement, one building at a time. And it just takes a long time to do this. And the other surprise has been the drones. The drones have been very effective. The Ukrainians have also improved their artillery. The ammunition promised by the West is starting to arrive on the front lines. And so, the Ukrainians are able to bring to bear artillery that forces the Russians to be cautious. The last thing you want to do when the enemy has the ability to reach out and touch you is to give them targets. And so, the Russians aren't going to mass their troops for a big breakout effort, only to find themselves covered by Ukrainian artillery, directed by Ukrainian drones, and you lose a lot of equipment. So again, the Ukrainians have capabilities that cause the Russians to pause and slowly use their advantages to wear down the enemy and then make your advance. And the Ukrainians are just running out of troops, running out of equipment. And as I said, eventually we're going to reach the point of collapse. And I believe that's going to take place. Here I go. I believe it's going to take place in the first half of 2025. So do a lot of other people. But, the Ukrainians have surprised everybody by their resilience. They're not going to win. It's not as though the Ukrainians are, holding on or able to come back with a knockout punch, but they will drag this thing out as long as they have bodies to sacrifice. And one of the tragedies is the Ukrainians are considering signing into law conscription, law that allows them to go down to 18 years old, and you're basically taking teenagers and put them to combat. Now we do that in the American military. I enlisted in the Army when I was 17, but the difference is I got trained and full training, not half-ass training. These 18-year-olds are going to be given very poor training, and then they're going to be thrown into a deteriorating situation on the front where they don't have the kind of experienced people left who are able to provide, the backbone of a unit and, that serves their mentors. They're going to be thrown out there. And if you listen to the debriefings of these Ukrainian prisoners of war, they're thrown in without a plan, without support. They're just, put into a trench and told to hold, and then they don't hear from their commander. And next thing you know, the Russians are there and they have a choice to surrender or die. And the ones who, most of these newly mobilized people opt for surrendering. The more experienced Ukrainian soldiers, they opt to die. And that's what makes this thing hard. But I think we're looking at, the collapse of the Ukrainian ability to maintain. And the question is, what does Russia do with that? And I think, we don't have an answer for that right now. We know that the Russians have committed to recovering the totality of Kherson. That includes the right bank, Zaporizhia, all of it, all of Donetsk, and they already have most, if not all, of Lugansk. Those are the four territories that were subjected to a referendum, a controversial referendum, but a referendum nonetheless in September of 2022. They voted to be absorbed into Russia, and they have been, and by law, by constitution, this is Mother Russia. And the Russians have said, it's ours. The war doesn't stop until we get it. Now, the question is, what does Russia do after that? And here's where there's some controversy. You've heard Medvedev, you've heard Putin, you've heard others allude to the possibility of Russia, moving on and taking Odessa, Kharkov, maybe Dnipropetrovsk, and Nikolaev. Sumy is now on the table because the Ukrainians were dumb enough to launch this offensive into Kursk from the Sumy province. But Putin hasn't made this a publicly announced objective. And so I do believe that if a good plan was put on the table, that this could be preserved. And I interviewed a Ukrainian prime minister, former Ukrainian prime minister, who's now part of the government in exile in Russia. And I asked him about the future of Odessa and Kharkov, because there's a school of thought that I adhere to that if Odessa and Kharkov are stripped away from Ukraine, it kills Ukraine economically, the future of Ukraine, and that's not necessarily the goal of Russia. And so his belief, and this is a former Ukrainian prime minister, is that Odessa and Kharkov remain with Ukraine, but the post-conflict Ukraine will be politically aligned with Russia. They'll call it neutral, but it won't be neutral. It'll be politically aligned with Russia, with an economic and political union with Russia, similar to that which exists with Belarus. But it'll have zero ties to NATO, zero ties to the West. And if that's the case, if that's the outcome that's achieved, then I think Odessa and Kharkov can stay with Ukraine. But Trump he floated his grossly irresponsible plan. I mean, everybody who we never saw the formal plan, but heard whispers of it. Everybody who heard a whisper of it said that's just not going to work. Russia will never. That's basically telling Russia you lost, and Russia's saying no, we won. We're winning, and we're going to win, and we're going to get everything we want out of this war, everything. And Trump needs to understand that. And I think this is a setback. Now the question is, what does Trump do? And hopefully he's being advised that they don't have any options, that eventually they're going to have to give the Russians what the Russians want. The sooner they give it, the better off Ukraine will be, even though Ukraine won't be in the Western orbit. You'll have a Ukraine that has economic viability because they retained some territorial integrity. But if Trump decides to play stupid games, talk about reinforcing the Ukrainians and getting NATO to spend more money, then Russia will just continue to do what it does until they've retaken all the territory they said they were going to take, and then they'll just move on and take more territory. And then in the end, we can see the total destruction of Ukraine. So we're at one of those pivot points right now where, there's some political decisions that have to be made. But one thing is certain, that militarily Russia has won this conflict and will continue to be winning this conflict. They're not going to yield back to the West anything that they've accomplished here. There will be no peacekeepers. I always tell people, well, what about peacekeepers? I said, well, do you know what a peacekeeper is? Peacekeeper is when two sides fight each other to a stalemate and they agree to a ceasefire. And the peacekeeper's job is to go in between them and keep the two warring parties apart. Why would Russia want that to happen when Russia's winning? There's no stalemate here. There's no frozen battlefield. Russia is advancing everywhere. And Russia will never say, yeah, we're just going to stop. We're going to give up all of our advantages. Because the moment, people also need to understand this, the collapse of the Ukrainian military is happening because of things that happen on the margin. It's not that the whole military suddenly collapses. It's that they're no longer able to maintain the kind of combat capacity along the entire front. And so gaps emerge, and those gaps get exploited, and then they create compound problems, and the Ukrainians have to pull back. The moment, and the key thing is to keep the Ukrainians unable to reinforce, unable to reorganize, totally off balance. And you do that by keeping the pressure forward, which is what the Russians are doing. The moment you have a ceasefire, all that pressure ceases. And the Ukrainians now will be able to come in and rapidly fill in the margins and create. It won't take long for the Ukrainians to actually reestablish cohesion on the front line. Why would Russia ever allow that to happen? Russia has had a strategy since, the rejection of the Istanbul Accords, Istanbul Communique, I think it was back in April, May I think in May of 2022, Russia said we're going into the next phase, which is, to recapture the Donbass. And at that point in time, it was a war of attrition. And basically, every time NATO and the United States poured in another $40 billion or so of material, Russia just adjusted and kept going in and grinding it down. And it took a long time. But Russia's never surrendered the advantages it's had, and it's always maintained this pressure. And now we're coming up to year 3, and why would Russia surrender this after all the sacrifices they've made, after everything that's been done to get them to this point? Why would Russia give any of it away? And the answer is they're not going to. And the sooner the United States realize it, because really America is the only vote that counts other than Putin. NATO's broke. Trump can talk about increasing defense spending from 2% to 5%. They don't have the ability to do that. Some of the smaller nations could do it for a short period of time, but the big nations can't. Germany definitely can't. France can't. And without that kind of expenditure, which over years necessary to rebuild a NATO military capacity, NATO doesn't have anything it can bring to the table. It has to have the United States, and Trump isn't going to do this. So the sooner Trump realizes that he literally has no cards, he's been dealt, he doesn't even have a pair of twos. He's got nothing. And he's already peeked into Putin's hand and he saw 3 aces. And he can just assume maybe there's a 4th one out there. You're not going to beat the Russians on this one. So the sooner Putin or Trump realizes this, the sooner the United States can come in and, be an effective leader in the West and tell NATO, no, we're done. Ukraine, it's over. And we're cutting our losses, and we're going to try and consolidate with what we have left. But Ukraine's a lost cause, and Russia wins because Russia has won.
Sergei Lavrov recently came out and said that this idea that Ukraine will have some kind of pause from NATO membership of 20 years, I believe, in this plan alone is reason to reject it. Comment on that.
Well, I mean, that's what I think Putin also said something about this. He said initially they wanted 10 years to get Ukraine. They said Ukraine's not ready for NATO membership, and they were looking for 10 years. And Putin said, well, 10 years to do what? Get them ready? Well, what does that mean? To turn them into NATO. And we're not going to let that happen. So the same concept is, 20 years. 20 years to do what? Get them ready to be a member of NATO. And Russia, that's an outcome that Russia will never allow. I mean, that I don't know why the West can't understand it, that this is an existential question for Russia, one which they are literally ready and willing to fight to the death about. And for Europe, this isn't an existential issue. I know we have some warmongers in NATO that try to make it seem like it, but Europe's not going to fight and die for Ukraine. The United States certainly isn't going to fight and die for Ukraine. Russia will fight and die to keep Ukraine from becoming part of NATO. And so there will be no 20-year pause, 50-year pause, because eventually those calendars run out. It was only 10 years ago that that the Maidan took place. And Viktor Yanukovych was ousted, and the new Ukrainian nationalist government, came into power. Years fly by, and eventually you get to 20, and then you're going to have to do this all over again. So Russia has sacrificed too much. They're going to solve this problem now, and that problem will be solved by a permanent treaty, and it will be a treaty that says Ukraine will never be a member of NATO, ever.
When Russia did launch the Oreshnik, there was similar talk about Russia is just bluffing. This wasn't that significant, and it's likely not going to launch this again. Now, Russia has indeed taken a long pause before it launches this weapon again. But could you talk about what Russia could do should Trump and the Trump administration take the rejection not so kindly and continue upon their own escalatory ladder.
There's two faces to Russia. There's the Dmitry Medvedev face. He is the rabid wolf, the bad cop, whatever you want to say. And he's just talking. He always articulates the extreme Russian positions. And then there's the reality of the Kremlin, the Putin Kremlin, which is a very, very steady, staid, pragmatic, realistic, voice that always shows patience, and it frustrates the heck out of people, especially in the West, analysts who, have taken a sympathetic line towards Russia, but they've, I think, allowed the fact that they see Russia being on the right side of history, meaning that they now have to, advocate for Russia. If you're an analyst, you can't advocate for anybody. You just got to report the facts. You're allowed to, if you believe it, to, emphasize the Russian facts over the Ukrainian facts. But you can't sit there and start cheerleading and then get disappointed when the Russian government doesn't do what you think the Russian government should have done. It's a trap I have to avoid all the time because I'm somebody who believes that Russia's on the right side of history. I think Russia, is justified in doing what it's doing. I'm also somebody who wants to see this war come to an end as soon as possible. And so, sometimes I catch myself being, come on, Russia, you got to do more than that. Then I remind myself that Vladimir Putin couldn't give a damn what I think or anybody else in the West. We don't factor in. Putin has a plan. He knows what he wants to achieve. And the other thing is we observers in the West sometimes become so focused on the war, we forget about what Russia was trying to do to avoid the war and how that defines and shapes their national security strategy. In December 17th of 2021, Russia provided 2 draft treaties on how to de-escalate this push towards a conflict in Ukraine, one to NATO, one to the United States. And it spoke of the need for a new European security framework that respected Russia's legitimate right to a sphere of influence and sphere of interest, and the same thing with the West having one. But Russia believed that in order to achieve this, the West had to pull back, the NATO had to pull back its military infrastructure to pre-1997 lines, that is before the big eastward expansion. Russia said, look, this is what we're looking for here. We'd like you to read it, and then we're willing to talk about it, negotiate about it, but we're not going to wait forever. But you have to take it seriously. Neither NATO nor the United States took it seriously, and the end result is that Russia was compelled to initiate, the special military operation. But the war will end, and when it does end, I think Russia is going to be putting those very treaties back on the table, modified somewhat to better represent the present reality. But Russia, that's what Russia's looking for. Russia's looking for stability. They're not looking to invade NATO, to invade Poland, to invade anything. They weren't looking to go into Ukraine. They were willing to settle this thing, by a treaty. But I think, that's the strategic vision. And so, what is Putin going to do? He has got his military in a position right now where they're heading him in that direction, where they're going to have a decisive military victory, sufficient to bring credence to these draft treaties. But he has to get there. And what you don't want to do is stumble. And one of the ways you stumble is by doing something that legitimizes Western intervention, an overreaction, things of that nature. So I think what the Russians did, my understanding is, because even after the Oreshnik was fired, Ukraine fired a couple more missiles into Russia. So Russia called basically General Gerasimov, who's the chairman of the chief of staff of the Russian armed forces, called General Brown, who's the chairman, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they had a conversation. And my understanding is that one of the things that Gerasimov said is, look, we understand this is a conflict, etc. If Ukraine wants to fire ATACMS missiles, they can only fire them into a certain depth. They get beyond that depth, these become strategic attacks, and we will respond accordingly, to include nuclear weapons. And I think Gerasimov laid it out in plain. And I think Brown took it to heart. And yes, there have been more ATACMS, use of ATACMS missiles, but not against the long-range targets. So it'd be interesting to see what happens in the next 20 days, because the Biden administration has just greenlit and told Ukraine, use all 50 before Trump comes in, because once you get them, once Trump comes in, he'll probably tell you you can't fire them anymore. So now you're the Ukrainians, and if you just use them the way you're allowed to use them, you're not going to achieve something. They need to get that big provocation. They need to have NATO intervene. They need to have Russia overreact. So I think we're going to see Ukraine using long-range strikes with these ATACMS missiles. And I think we're going to see Russia, if anything, respond with Oreshnik, but probably not. And the reason why I say that is they just rejected Donald Trump's initial overture. And for Trump, that's embarrassing, especially after what he said about one phone call. Do you really want to embarrass him more? There's only 50 ATACMS left. They're not going to do a knockout punch. I think Russia is going to absorb whatever Ukraine fires at them and continue to respond with the conventional capabilities, but they won't go to the Oreshnik anymore until Trump comes in. And then the question is what Trump does. And if Trump decides to play the escalation game, now the Russians will have the Oreshnik that can be used. But I think in the remaining time of the Biden administration, there's no reason for them to use Oreshnik, because their goal is nothing the Ukrainians do with Storm Shadow, ATACMS, Scalp is going to change what's happening on the battlefield. It's going to cost Russia, resources, manpower. It's going to be embarrassing. But at the end of the day, the Russian army will continue to advance. The Ukrainian army will continue to collapse, and we're headed in the inevitable outcome. And that's Putin's objective. He needs to get to the point where he can put those draft treaties on the table, but not in a position where the West thinks, but we still have control over Ukraine. We're going to, transform Ukraine. But in a position where Russia says, we own Ukraine. Ukraine's not part of your equation anymore. So maybe you want to take a look at these treaties and see what how we can implement them. And I think that's the direction we're heading. So I think we're going to see a lot of patience from Vladimir Putin until Donald Trump becomes president. And then I think there's going to be about a six-month window where Russia will work with the United States to come up with a solution. But at the end of 6 months, if they're not, then Russia's just going to say, well, we're done talking. You're just delaying this thing. We're gonna administer the coup de grace. It's going to be interesting to see how the Trump administration does this. How do you negotiate? Normally, what you want is a good faith measure. You say, all right, we'll negotiate, but you need to agree to a ceasefire. And a ceasefire is something you agree to when you're getting sort of the snot kicked out of you, where you're saying, well, we got to stabilize our front. We have to buy time to resupply our people. And the Russians are like, well, we don't need to do that. We don't need to stabilize. So the Trump negotiating team's not going to have any of the traditional. Remember how we brought it into the Korean War, the last frozen conflict. The Chinese and the North Koreans would play games at the negotiating table, and we would launch a major offensive against Pork Chop Hill or some other hill. Send the Marines in to slaughter the Chinese and take another piece of territory. Of course, we'd lose a lot of guys too, but then the Chinese would be like, okay, we'll come and talk. Then when they hesitate again, we'd come in and hit them again. And very bloody fighting, but that's how we put leverage on the Chinese, is on the battlefield. Trump doesn't have any leverage to put on the Russians. The Ukrainians don't have the ability to bring pain to the Russians like the Russians can bring to Ukraine. So it's going to be a very interesting negotiation. This is why if the Trump administration would ever take my advice, it would be literally sit down with Putin and say, we're going to give you everything you asked for, but please let us pick the wrapping paper that we put on this gift. So, it looks like at least we had some say in this. And I think the Russians will work with them so that there's some sort of face-saving mechanism, but not to the detriment of Russia's strategic objectives.